Hi, and welcome to the Christian Gamer channel. I'm Paul, and I'm using this space to share my insights from the Bible. I want to be clear right up front. I don't claim to have any special authority. I'm not a pastor, a theologian, an apostle, or anything special. I'm just an ordinary person who reads their Bible and wants to share what I've learned with the wider community. Because of that, your personal insights are absolutely no less valid than mine. I strongly urge you to join the conversation. If you disagree with anything I've said, or if you want to add something you think I've missed or glossed over, you are actively encouraged to do so. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments or even share a link to your own video. I know sharing biblical insights can be intimidating, especially in an age where simply trying to tell the truth can risk persecution or the fear of it down the road. But remember, God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and self-control. So let's not be afraid to stand firm and share our faith and insights with courage. Okay, let's do this. And in part 4 of Can We Trust the Bible, we're looking at the New Testament canon. So how we got the New Testament. The journey from individual letters and scrolls to the bound New Testament in your hand is less of a single official event and more of a centuries-long organic consensus. It wasn't a secret meeting in a dark room where books were voted on like a reality show. It was a slow burn process over the early church deciding which writings actually rang true to their experience of faith. The compilation of the New Testament. Before there was a New Testament, there were just letters and memoirs. So first we've got the epistles. The apostolic letters were likely the first to be written and circulated. The logic behind this is that a letter is quickly dashed off to address an immediate need. When we read the epistles, we're reading a piece of writing that was composed to address a need that was happening at the time. It would be the strongest possible historical witness. It's just a shame we only have one side of a conversation. However, we have to infer the circumstances that precipitated the writing of the epistles of Paul, James, John, and Peter. If only the churches kept the letters that were written to the apostles and not just the letters that were written by the apostles, we'd have a much clearer picture of what life was like for the first century Christians. The Gospels, composition and context. The Gospels were written later than the epistles, most likely between 60 to 100 of the Common Era, as the original eyewitnesses began to pass away and the church required a permanent record of Jesus' life. If we accept the traditional authorship and the criteria for canonization, which required a strong, long-standing tradition attributing the text to its namesake, we can conclude these works originated within the lifetimes of the authors or their immediate sources. So the Gospel of Matthew was traditionally martyred in Ethiopia around 68 of the Common Era. Mark, tradition holds that John Mark composed his Gospel based on the preaching of Peter, who was martyred in Rome roughly 64 to 68 of the Common Era. Mark himself was reportedly martyred in Alexandria in 68 of the Common Era. Luke, traditionally believed to have been written alongside the book of Acts as a defence for St. Paul while he awaited trial in Rome. Paul was martyred around 64 to 68 of the Common Era by beheading. Luke is said to have lived to the age of 84 before his martyrdom in Greece. And John, the only evangelist not to suffer a violent martyrdom. John was exiled to the island of Patmos, where he recorded the book of Revelation, that's Revelation 1:9. This makes the dating of the Gospels Matthew, Mark and Luke relatively simple. They must have been written prior to 64 to 68 of the Common Era. Now, the compilation of the New Testament, the dating of the Gospel of John. John's Gospel is the most difficult to date, but is widely considered the last of the four, around 80 to 100 AD. While the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, record Jesus predicting the physical destruction of the temple, that's Matthew 24, 1-2, Mark 13, 1-2, and Luke 21, 5-6, John omits this. Instead, he focuses on the temple of Jesus' body. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. That's John 2, verses 19 to 21. The shift in worship. Jesus tells the Samaritan woman that true worshippers will worship neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem, but in spirit and in truth. John 4, 21 to 23. It appears John was comforting a people reeling from the loss of the Second Temple, that'll make it post 70 AD, teaching them that the physical structure was no longer necessary for access to God. The Bible of the early church. At this stage, the Gospels and Epistles were not yet bound into a single Bible. They were individual resources read aloud in liturgical gatherings. The Bible used by the early church was a Septuagint. These Greek scrolls were more accessible and affordable than the Hebrew scrolls, which were painstakingly hand-copied and treated as sacred objects, housed primarily in the synagogues. The unofficial collection, that's circa 100 to 200 AD. By the 2nd century, local churches began swapping documents. If the church in Rome had, say, a copy of Romans, which they're likely to do, being that Paul wrote to the Romans, they'd trade a copy with the church in Ephesus for, say, the Gospel of John or Paul's letter to the Ephesians. During this time, 3 informal criteria emerged to determine which books were worth keeping. Apostolicity. Was it written by an apostle or someone close to them, like Luke or Mark? Orthodoxy. Did the teaching align with the rule of faith passed down orally? And Catholicity, universality. Was the book being used by the whole church or just one weird sect? And I would like to point out in this video, if I use the word Catholicity, I'm actually referring to universally amongst all the first century churches. I'm not saying it was ordained by the Catholic Church as we know it today. Which brings us to the heretic Marcion of Sinope, or Sinope, however it's pronounced. And Marcion of Sinope, a bishop of Asia Minor, born in AD 85, he was the son of a bishop in Pontus. His early life as the son of a bishop and wealthy shipowner gave him both religious exposure and the means to travel widely, shaping the ideas that would eventually be condemned as heresy. His travels exposed him to diverse Christian communities and interpretations of Scripture, likely sharpening his sense that Christian teaching lacked uniformity. So why was Marcion heretical? The early church, even in the apostolic age, was no stranger to heresy. In the very early ages of the church history, the primary heresy that took up most of the apostles' time was the Jew-Gentile controversy, where many of the Hebraic Jews and circumcised converts to Judaism wanted to insist that Gentiles could not become Christians until they first formally converted to Judaism. This is the primary reason Paul stormed off to Jerusalem, sleeves rolled up, spoiling for a fight. We can read that in Galatians 2, 1-10 and Acts 15, 1-21. However, later on, towards the end of the apostolic age, as the number of Gentile converts far exceeded the number of Jewish converts, and especially in the Asian theatre, Greek philosophy infiltrated the church in the form of Gnosticism, which is perhaps why John's Gospels and letters, which were written later, focuses far more on the divinity of Christ. Shortly after the Apostolic Age, Marcion of Sinope taught a further heresy, so unique to him that the heresy is known as Marcionism. While having some things in common with Gnosticism and clearly influenced by Gnostic philosophy, Marcion rejected Gnosticism in favour of his own unique theology. So Marcion versus the Gnostics. While Marcion was clearly influenced by Gnostic teachings, his teachings differed from Gnosticism in some important ways. Firstly, salvation. In Gnosticism, this is achieved through gnosis, secret mystical knowledge. In Marcionism, it's achieved through faith in the mercy of the Father. And origins. Complex mythologies with many aeons or lesser divine beings. In Marcionism, there's just two gods, no complex divine family tree. The Creator, often seen as evil or a bumbling accident, Sophia's mistake. Sophia, by the way, is the Greek word meaning wisdom. And in Marcionism, the Creator is just seen as lawful but legalistic and stern. And in Gnosticism, the spark, humans have a divine spark trapped inside them, whereas in Marcionism, humans are purely the creation of the lower God and have no right to salvation until the Father adopts us. Now, in the eyes of the early church, Marcion of Sinope wasn't just someone with a few hot takes. He was arguably the first great heresiarch, because his teachings struck to the very foundation of Christian identity. In the mid-2nd century, around 144 of the Common Era, Marcion presented a version of Christianity that completely severed its ties to Judaism. Here's a breakdown of why the early church leaders, like Tertullian and Irenaeus, found his views so dangerous. Firstly, dualism, the two gods. The biggest heresy was Marcion's claim that there were actually two different gods. The Creator, the Demiurge, the God of the Old Testament, Marcion described him as a just but wrathful, ignorant and vengeful deity who created a flawed material world. The Supreme Father, the God of the New Testament revealed by Jesus. This God was pure love and mercy, previously unknown to humanity, and had no part in the creation of the physical world. Why it was a problem. This contradicted the core Jewish Christian belief in monotheism, that the God of Abraham is the same God who sent Jesus, and rejection of the Old Testament. Because Marcion believed the Creator God was inferior, he argued that the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, should be completely discarded by Christians. He viewed the law of Moses not as a precursor to Christ, but as the oppressive shackles of a lesser God. Our Docetism, or the Ghost Jesus. Marcion's distaste for the material world led him to Docetism, from the Greek dokein, to seem. He argued that if the material world was the work of an inferior God, Jesus could not have possessed a real flesh and blood body. He taught that Jesus simply appeared in Judea as a grown man. He denied the nativity, no birth, and the physical resurrection. That really stinks of Greek influence there, doesn't it? That's some serious Greek philosophy going on there. Needless to say, these doctrines undermine much of the apostolic teachings. This forced Marcion to create a canon of books that were acceptable, books that supported his beliefs, though even those he edited out the bits that contradicted his beliefs. So the Marcionite canon, this is the first New Testament canon, at circa 130 to 140 of the Common Era. The Marcionite canon is the oldest canon that we know of. Marcion was a heretical teacher and his canon was largely rejected by the church. Marcion's canon consisted of the Gospel of Marcion, which closely resembles the Gospel of Luke. He most likely edited the Gospel of Luke according to his theology and renamed it. And then we have the books Galatians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, Laodiceans, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. The letter to the Laodiceans is not referring to the clumsy forgery which was written in Latin probably around the mid-4th century, found in the Latin Codex Fuldensis, but almost certainly a misnaming of the canonical book we know today as Ephesians. Again, he most likely edited the book of Ephesians and renamed it. The publishing of a canon by this heretical teacher nevertheless caused the early church to begin asking serious questions about which scriptures were authentic and which were not, causing the church to focus on the process of canonization. So the need for a canon. Before Marcion, scripture generally referred to the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. There were many letters and gospels floating around, but no official list. Marcion's attempt to strip the library down to one edited gospel and 10 letters forced the early church to say, wait, we need to decide what exactly belongs in the Bible. The anti-Marcionite strategy. The church used 3 main criteria to determine if a book was in or out. You can think of this as the original verified check mark. Apostolicity, or the source, and the rule, a book had to be written by an apostle or a direct associate of one. The defense. Marcion claimed only Paul had the truth. The church countered by canonizing all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, to show a symphony of witnesses rather than a solo act. Orthodoxy, the message. The rule. The content had to align with the rule of faith, the traditional oral teachings passed down from the beginning. The defense. This is where they filtered out the Gnostics. If a book suggested that Jesus was a ghost or that the material world was an evil mistake, it was rejected. This is why the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas didn't make the cut. Well, it's one of the reasons. And Catholicity, the reach, the rule. Was this book being used and read by churches everywhere, universal, or just by one weird sect in a basement? The defense. By choosing books that were already widely loved across the Roman Empire, the church created a united front against Marcion's specific localized sect. So the shape of the resulting library. To make the rejection of Marcionism permanent, the church structured the New Testament in a way that bridged the Old and New worlds. The Book of Acts. This was the bridge. It connects the Gospels to the Epistles and proves that Paul, Marcion's hero, was actually in total agreement with the other apostles in Jerusalem. The general epistles. Letters from James, Peter and Jude were included to show that Paul wasn't the only authority, effectively diluting Marcion's Paul-only theology. The Old Testament. The church doubled down, placing the New Testament right after the Old to show that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Creator's promises, not a replacement for them. And a masterstroke of irony. In his attempt to shrink the Bible, Marcion actually caused it to grow. Without his heresy acting as a catalyst, the church might have gone centuries longer without a formal binding list of books. It's the ultimate historical backfire. Marcion tried to delete the Old Testament and most of the New, and the church responded by getting really serious about what books are inspired and what books are not, so as to guard against future heretics editing the scriptures to suit their theology. The Diatessaron of Tatian, circa 160 to 175 AD. Tatian took a unique approach. Instead of 4 separate Gospels, he wove them together into one continuous narrative. The endorsement. For a long time the Syrian churches preferred this gospel harmony over the individual 4 Gospels. And the outcome, it was eventually suppressed in the 5th century because the church felt it was vital to keep the 4 distinct apostolic voices separate rather than blended. That brings us to the Muratorian fragment, circa 170 to 200 AD. The fragment is a 7th or 8th century Latin manuscript, but it's a copy of a list originally written in Greek, likely around 170 to 200 AD. It was discovered in the Ambrosian Library in Milan by Ludovico Antonio Muratori in 1740, hence the name. As a fragment, pieces are missing with regards to the Gospels. It only lists Luke and John, but insists 4 Gospels are canon. The most logical inference is that Matthew and Mark would almost certainly have been at the beginning of the list. So found in the 18th century, this is the oldest known orthodox list. It's a bit of a mixed bag compared to what we have today. And again, I'm using the word orthodox to mean truthful, as opposed to the actual name of the Orthodox Church. So when I say Orthodox list, I don't mean it's anything to do with the Orthodox Church, only that this is the oldest known list that is accepted by the churches. So what's included in the Muratorian fragment? The 4 Gospels and Acts, the 13 letters of Paul, Jude, 1 and 2 John, and the Revelation of John and the Revelation of Peter. And what is excluded or debated are the books of Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter. There's a letter to the Laodiceans that's mentioned in the list as fake. Included but not for reading in churches is the Shepherd of Hermas. And I should also point out that while including the Apocalypse of Peter in the canon, the fragment makes the disclaimer that some will not allow the Apocalypse of Peter to be read in church. So the key characteristics. The physical state. It's a fragment because the beginning and end are missing. It starts mid-sentence. The content. It lists the books that the author considered canonical or authoritative for the church to read. And the context, it was likely written in or near Rome. And that brings us to the sifting process, circa 200 to 300 AD. So we're now moving into the period where they're really starting to decide which books are in and which books are out. This is where things got official adjacent. Church fathers like Origen and Eusebius began categorizing books into 3 groups. So recognized were the 4 Gospels, Acts, Paul's letters, 1 Peter and 1 John. And disputed were books like Hebrews, James, 2 Peter and Revelation. Some thought they were great, others weren't so sure. And then spurious or heretical books like the Gospel of Thomas, which didn't match the established theology of the other churches. Now Origen's list, that's circa 250 AD. The scholar Origen, or Origen, however it's pronounced, was one of the first to categorize books by their level of controversy across the various Christian hubs, Rome, Alexandria and Antioch. The accepted Homologumenia, the 4 Gospels, 13 Pauline epistles, 1 Peter, 1 John, Acts and Revelation. The disputed Antilegomenia, Hebrews. He liked the theology but doubted Paul wrote it. James, Jude, 2 Peter and 2nd and 3rd John. And the rejected, the Gospel of the Egyptians and the Gospel of Thomas. This brings us to the two great witnesses, the Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, circa 325 to 350 AD. These are our oldest complete physical Bibles, well, almost complete. The Codex Vaticanus is actually missing a chunk at the end. They show us exactly what was being bound together just before Athanasius wrote his famous letter. Interestingly, they still included books that we now call the Apostolic Fathers. The Codex Sinaiticus included the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas as part of the New Testament. Formal recognition came in around 367 to 397 AD. The aha moment happened in 397 AD when Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, wrote a festal letter, that's an annual letter written by bishops for Easter, listing the exact 27 books we use today. This list was later confirmed by the councils of Hippo in 393 AD and Carthage in 397 AD. This was his 39th festal letter. Many people think the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, chose the Bible. That's actually a common myth. Nicaea was focused on the nature of Jesus, or the Trinity. They didn't even have the canon on the official agenda. Which brings us to the Codex Alexandrinus, circa 400 to 450 of the Common Era. Interestingly, even after Athanasius and the Council of Hippo, 393 AD, and Carthage, 397 AD, Bibles were bound together with works of the Church Fathers. For example, the Codex Alexandrinus included 1 and 2 Clement, demonstrating that just because books were bound together doesn't necessarily mean they were approved for reading in church. We should therefore be very careful about what assumptions we make about the canonicity of a book based on what it is bound with in a single volume. Okay, so let's look at the books of the canon. So we're looking at the out group, close but no cigar. First Clement, right but late. Written around 96 CE, this letter was highly respected and even read aloud in many churches like Corinth for centuries. The successor issue. Even though tradition links this Clement to the one mentioned by Paul in Philippians 4:3, the church viewed his writings as ecclesiastical, church leadership, rather than revelatory. And the content. It focuses heavily on church discipline and the apostolic succession. While useful for order, it didn't carry the gospel-founding weight required for the New Testament. And Second Clement, an identity crisis. The case against Second Clement is even stronger because it suffers from a double whammy of doubt. It's not an epistle, despite the name. It isn't actually a letter. It's an anonymous homily, a sermon, arguably the oldest surviving Christian sermon outside the Bible. And it's not by Clement. Even in the early centuries, scholars like Eusebius noticed the style was completely different from 1 Clement. Modern scholars are certain the two works have different authors. Because its origin was anonymous and uncertain, it couldn't pass the strict test for canonization. And the Shepherd of Hermas. While it was incredibly popular in the early church, even appearing in the famous 4th century Codex Sinaiticus, the oldest complete manuscript Bible, it was ultimately excluded during the finalization of the New Testament. Why was it excluded? The early church used 3 main tests to determine if a book belonged in the New Testament. The Shepherd of Hermas failed or was seen as weak in several of these areas. We should know the 3 tests by now. Apostolicity, the primary reason. To be canonical, a book generally had to be written by an apostle or someone in their immediate circle. The Muratorian Fragment, one of the oldest lists of New Testament books, circa 170 AD, explains that while the Shepherd should be read, it could not be read publicly in churches because it was written very recently in our own times by Hermas, the brother of Pope Pius I. Since it was written decades after the apostles had died, it lacked the apostolic authority required for canonization. And then there's theological concerns. The book contained a somewhat confusing Christology, its description of Jesus. It occasionally seems to suggest that Jesus was a man who became divine because of his virtue, a view later known as adoptionism, which conflicted with the developing doctrine of the Trinity. It also taught that there was only one chance for repentance for serious sins after baptism, a rigorist view that many church leaders found too harsh or inconsistent with other scriptures. And then content and style. Unlike the Gospels or epistles, the Shepherd is a very strong allegorical work filled with visions and parables, similar in style to the Pilgrim's Progress. Some early fathers, like St. Jerome, found the style distasteful or simply unnecessary when compared to the existing New Testament. And lack of universal consensus. While it was beloved in Egypt and Rome, it was less known or accepted in other works of the Christian world. Over time, as the core 27 books of the New Testament gained universal acceptance, the Shepherd was moved to a category of useful for reading, but not divinely inspired scripture. And then we have the Epistle of Barnabas, which was likely written between 70 of the Common Era and 135 of the Common Era. The Epistle of Barnabas is a fascinating piece of early Christian literature. It was highly regarded in the early church. However, despite its popularity, it was ultimately excluded from the formal biblical canon. Its doubtful apostolic authorship. While the work bears the name of Barnabas, the companion of the Apostle Paul, most early church fathers and modern scholars agree he didn't actually write it. Internal evidence. The text reflects a level of hostility towards Jewish rituals that doesn't align with the historical Barnabas, who was a Levite and often acted as a bridge between the Jewish and Gentile Christians. This is the primary reason the early church considered it pseudepigraphal. And then extreme allegorical interpretation. The author uses a very heavy-handed style of allegory to reinterpret the Old Testament. While other New Testament books, like Hebrews, use allegory, the Epistle of Barnabas goes much further. It argues that the Jewish people never actually had a covenant with God because they broke it immediately at Mount Sinai. It claims that Jewish laws, like dietary restrictions or circumcision, were never meant to be taken literally, but were purely spiritual metaphors. The verdict: the mainstream early church found this replacement theology too radical, as it essentially invalidated the historical reality of the Hebrew Scriptures, and the late dating and geographical limits. For a book to be considered canonical, the early church generally required it to be ancient from the apostolic age and Catholic, widely used by the universal church. While Barnabas was popular in Alexandria and used by Clement and Origen, it never gained the same universal footing in the Latin West or the Syrian East as the four Gospels or Paul's letters. And the Apocalypse of Peter. This is where things get really interesting. For a while, the Apocalypse of Peter was actually a front runner for the New Testament. Why it was almost in. In the late 2nd century, specifically the Muratorian Fragment, it was listed alongside the Revelation of John. It provides a vivid guided tour of heaven and hell. Why it was ultimately excluded. gory detail. Unlike the biblical revelation, which focuses on the victory of the Lamb and the New Jerusalem, the Apocalypse of Peter gets, well, graphic. It describes specific punishments for sins, for example, blasphemers hanging by their tongues. And theological oddities. It contains a passage that some interpreted as suggesting that the prayers of the saved could eventually empty hell, a concept called universalism that the institutional church was becoming wary of, and spurious origin. By the 4th century, bishops like Eusebius and Athanasius concluded it wasn't actually written by Peter, but was a later fan fiction or pseudepigrapha from the 2nd century. And this brings us to the in group, disputed but accepted. So firstly, the book of Hebrews. The problem? It is anonymous. The Greek is much more sophisticated than Paul's usual style. And why it made it? The Eastern Church insisted it was Paul's, thinking he perhaps used a translator or an amanuensis. More importantly, the content was too powerful to ignore. Its explanation of how Jesus fills the Old Testament priesthood was considered essential for Christian theology. I'd like to take a short break to share a personal opinion. Growing up, I was a huge ABBA fan. I'd listen to their music over and over and generally looked down on music other than ABBA. It's only in my older age that I've come to appreciate the talent of so many other musicians and bands and realised what I was missing out on. I was devastated when, in 1983, ABBA split up. Then in 1986 I heard the song One Night in Bangkok by Murray Head. It sent shivers down my spine. It was like I was hearing the ghost of ABBA. I thought I was going crazy until a little later I learned that the music was written by Benny Andersson and Bjorn Ulvaeus. Sometimes we can sense the fingerprints of someone on a piece of work even if we can't articulate our reasoning. I feel the same way about the book of Hebrews. After reading Romans through to Philemon, I had grown accustomed to the way Paul writes, so much so that I didn't notice that Paul's name doesn't appear on the book of Hebrews. It's just so Pauline in nature, and so very unlike James and the epistles of Peter and John and Jude, which have a noticeably different style. If Paul didn't write Hebrews, it was written by someone so very close to Paul that they picked up so much of Paul's theology that they sound just like Paul. If Paul did not write Hebrews, I believe it would most likely have been written by Barnabas, who was a very close companion to Paul, and, as a Levite, he would have been very familiar not only with the law, but also the temple, its layout and its sacrifices. It's not surprising then that the book of Hebrews fits nicely between the Pauline epistles and the non-Pauline epistles, forming a bridge between the Pauline and the Catholic epistles. James and Jude. The problem? James was too Jewish for some. Martin Luther famously called it an epistle of straw much later. Jude was controversial because it quotes the non-canonical books like 1 Enoch. Why they made it? They were firmly linked to the Brothers of the Lord. The early church decided their practical wisdom and direct connection to the Jerusalem church outweighed the concerns about their specific sources. 2 Peter. The problem? This was the most doubted book in the New Testament. The style is radically different from 1 Peter. Why it made it? It was eventually accepted as containing the authentic voice and teaching of Peter, even if a secretary, amanuensis, wrote it. It served as a vital defense against early Gnosticism. And this brings us to our lessons. And again, these are my lessons. If you have different lessons, please feel free to leave them in the comments. So the power of communal discernment. The insight. The New Testament wasn't handed down as a finished product. It was an organic, centuries-long consensus by ordinary believers ringing true to their experience of faith. And the lesson. Faith is not just an individual pursuit, but a shared one. While it's important to study the Bible for ourselves and have our own relationship with God, we should also value the wisdom and history of the global church rather than relying solely on our own individual interpretations. And the next lesson is integrity over convenience. The insight. The early church rejected Tatian's diatessaron, a single smoothed gospel harmony, because they felt it was more important to preserve the four distinct, sometimes messy, apostolic voices than to have one perfect narrative. And the lesson. Truth is often found in multiple perspectives. We should resist the urge to oversimplify or edit the truth just to make it more comfortable or easier to understand. And the next lesson is the role of conflict in growth. The insight. The heresy of Marcion acted as a necessary catalyst that forced the church to finally define what it actually believed and which books were authentic. And the lesson. Challenges and disagreements aren't always negative. They can be the very things that force us to clarify our convictions and strengthen our foundations. And the key takeaway from all this. The Bible you hold is not the result of a secret power play, but a hard-won legacy of truth. The New Testament was forged in the fire of persecution and heresy. It was sifted by thousands of people over hundreds of years who were willing to die for those specific words. Because it survived such a rigorous, transparent and organic vetting process, we can trust that these 27 books aren't there by accident. They are there because they were the ones that truly transformed the world. Okay, I hope you found that helpful. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps a small channel. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.